After 8 years of talks, China and 14 other nations in the Asia-Pacific formally signed one of the world's largest regional free trade agreements, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. What are the implications of a deal that covers 30% of the world's population and GDP? How will it drive regional integration? How do we respond to concerns over China's role in the process and Beijing's influence in the region? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Professor Zhang Gang from the University of International Business and Economics, Marcus Rubenstein, editor of APAC News, Kei Shimizu, assistant professor from University of Pittsburgh. Later on, we'll be talking to Henry Gao from Singapore Management University and Professor M.D. Nalapat from Manipal University. This is Dialogue on One Goal. Professor Gong, let me go to you first. So this is RCEP, the newest deal, the largest of its kind anywhere in the world. Tell us, how exactly does this work? Because some countries, member states, they have bilateral and trilateral agreements. Do this trade deal work in complement with those existing deals?
It's an overriding agreement among a couple of countries, 15 countries including RCEP, 3 countries in the north, 2 Australia and New Zealand in the south. So of course, these countries have bilateral agreements among themselves. For example, China and South Korea have a bilateral trade agreement, but they're not in conflict. That's one thing. The second thing is that I think this agreement goes way beyond just a trade agreement. We call it a trade agreement. It's actually more than that. They belong to the what's called the next generation free trade agreements, FTAs, that encompass other issues such as investment, for example, e-commerce, for example, intellectual property rights protection, competition policy. These things that are usually absent in the old generation of free trade agreements like WTO. So it's more than just a trade agreement. It covers a couple of other things, and these things are all relevant to multilateral or bilateral economic relationships. So that's why you're starting to see more and more these things getting into the free trade agreements. Yeah, lots of countries signed and ratified it, including Australia, where our guest Marcus is. Marcus, let me go to you. Australia, of course, is a treaty ally of the United States, a strong security military ally of Washington, and yet still, it is a signatory state to this trade deal. What is the consideration of Australia?
Look, Australia's been part of these negotiations, obviously, for the duration, I don't think that necessarily the China-US, Australia-US relationship was at the forefront whilst the negotiations were carried on. But certainly now, I think there is an anti-China sentiment in Australia. It is a very, very small, although vocal and influential group, aided by the media here, particularly the Rupert Murdoch-owned press, which ironically enough is an American media company and an American proprietor. But I think the loss of Trump, or if he in fact decides to vacate the White House, the Biden administration, I think that's caused a bit of consternation in Australia and pause for thought. And maybe we need to look to strengthen our regional ties here outside of security. So, from establishing a dialogue point of view to having an Australia which sees itself as part of Asia and looks to better integrate with Asia, I think the sentiment from this is certainly positive.
Despite the political and security tensions between our two countries. Right, Kei, let me go to you in Tokyo, Japan. How do you look at this trade deal? What does Japan want to get out of it?
First of all, I think the signing of the RCEP, through this, Asia has really defied the decoupling trend and will try to show that continued engagement and trade will benefit participants and bring about mutual prosperity, especially during this time of economic difficulty through much of the world. However, trade, of course, is not a zero-sum game, and we really don't lose anything by having more participants. And furthermore, RCEP is viewed by some as being largely symbolic, especially lacking more meaningful content compared to the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP. the successor to the TPP. So there's still work to do, and we should really not be just simply satisfied with the status quo, but this is a big step forward. And as far as Japan is concerned, the current U.S. administration has not necessarily supported stronger ties between and among East Asia's economic powerhouses, especially China, Japan, and South Korea. So each country, including Japan, really recognizes the importance of these relationships, and RCEP has really helped, especially China, Japan, and South Korea, come under a single FTA by incorporating our neighboring countries. And that is really a big achievement, because these three countries have not had a very easy time coming under a single free trade agreement. And this is something that's very much recognized by Japan. And global trade is expected to increase by almost 2% under RCEP, with potential spillover effects to non-signatory countries. So during this time of economic hardship around the world, this is really a bright light, and Japan hopes to do its part to encourage RCEP's further expansion, both in terms of membership, but also in terms of content.
Well, you just said that this RCEP is perhaps not as strong as CPTPP, the successor to TPP. The Obama administration was very keen on advocating. Why exactly do you think that's the case?
Well, there's certainly some content-wise dimensions that are missing from the RCEP, and perhaps this was necessary in order to get the signatories to agree to the agreement, especially from China's perspective. And also, we know that in the end, India did not get to participate, and this is a really big loss for the agreement. But in the short term, I think RCEP can still encourage trade between the signatory nations, especially as some nations around the world become more insular. But in the longer run, growth in the region, as well as global growth, cannot come at the cost of, for example, labor agreements and environmental agreements that are not deeply part of this agreement in its current state. And these really are not precious resources that we should be willing to sacrifice in the longer run. So in fact, longer-term economic recovery really depends on the ability to protect labor and the environment. So in this sense, I think there's much more room for RCEP to really strengthen itself in terms of content.
Professor Gong, do you want to respond?
Well, at least I think from Japan's perspective, this agreement brings a lot of benefits to Japan. If you compare this to CPTPP, for example, Japan doesn't have agreement with South Korea. There's a trade dispute with South Korea. Now it's part of the same family, what's called RCEP. It doesn't have an agreement with China. Now there's agreement with China. The differences between the difference of content in RCEP and CPTPP, in my opinion, are mostly centering on two things. One is environmental issues, as your previous guest has mentioned. Another one is union, labor-related issues. I think these issues also cannot be addressed in these very comprehensive trade agreements among many countries. Different countries have different perspectives on these issues. And these things that, doesn't mean that China, for example, doesn't pay attention to these issues, even if these issues are not contained in RCEP. Environmental protection, for example, is very much an internal and domestic issue. In any country, with or without free trade agreement, is going to respect protection of environment. We're doing a heck of a job in that area. So I think for the sake of reaching an agreement, we have gone through this for 9 years, and different countries have different perspectives on these issues. And just for the sake of trying to sign this thing before the end of the year, I think we can afford setting aside these issues that are mostly heralded by Americans in the CPTPP negotiation, original TPP negotiation. And at this point, we at least signed this thing, and I think it's a great achievement. This comparison between CPTPP and RCEP, in my opinion, in that perspective, is a little bit overblown. I mean, I think it's not much of a big deal, and that the fact will speak for itself. This is a much larger agreement, encompassing many more countries and many more people. And I think the prospect of this agreement is going to succeed. It's going to go well beyond the the CPTPP. I mean, this was originally designed by Americans, but it actually was drawn from it.
And they pulled out, and Japan took
Exactly.
over, sort of. Marcus, let me go to you. How do you see this new trade pact, RCEP, helping countries, in a post-COVID economic recovery?
Look, I think Asia has been the powerhouse of economic growth. Asia was shielded from the global financial crisis through the strength of China, through, I guess, the lessons of the Asian financial crisis, and just being sensible enough, if you will, not to have exposure to quite toxic assets in the US. From an Australian perspective, I think the RCEP's opportunity, which I'm not entirely sure we as a nation will take, the opportunity is for dialogue. We have a comprehensive free trade agreement with China. About 30% of our exports go to China. Indeed, in the second quarter, about 44 or 45% of our exports went to China. Trade is not the issue. Dialogue is the issue. And Australia, I'm sorry to say, even though we are, for all intents and purposes, an Asian nation in the Asian region, there are too many key policymakers who think of us as a Western country, as part of the old British Empire or close to America. We're not. We're an Asian country, and I think we don't have a great understanding of our Asian trading partners. Certainly that's the case with China. There's a frightening lack of understanding of Chinese culture, of Chinese people, and Chinese business. And ironically, the people in Australia who best understand China and to best appreciate business with China are the ones who are hurting the most from this current trade spat we have. Australian farmers, Australian fishermen, lobster fishermen, who I've spoken to, many of them, have incredibly great relationships with China because they understand it's about people-to-people engagement. So it would be a bit foolhardy for commentators in Australia and for politicians to say this RCEP opens us up to a dozen or more new potential trading partners. You need to have dialogue. You need to meet with your partners. You need to build trust and friendship and dialogue, and that's what we're lacking. But hopefully this dialogue will happen amongst the other partners, and Australia might pick up and say, this is what we need to do. New Zealand does a very good job. I think we should learn a lot from New Zealand on how to trade with our Asian partners.
Okay. Talking about the geopolitical flavor, propelled by some politicians and commentators surrounding RCEP. One question is, who is leading this organization? Professor Gong, I read so much Western media headlines these days, and they're talking about this China-led initiative. It was not precisely China-led, right?
It was started by ASEAN. I mean, if you look at this agreement, it's basically expansion of ASEAN countries into a much larger bloc, including 3 neighbors in the north, 2 neighbors in the south. So in my view, this is an expanded version of ASEAN, in my opinion. We might change the name of ASEAN, okay? And I think, hopefully it's moving in the direction of a Asian Union, okay? Analogous to European Union.
Like the European Union.
Yeah, like European Union, exactly. So, and of course, it's not going to be at that level because it's a much, much more unified market in Europe. But here, we're just making a first step towards that direction, okay? And I think that represents a very good direction. And I think that, with more economic activities happening, with a much, much faster economic growth in this region, this is the epicenter of the world economic activities. This is where the growth is most going to be seen in the future.
Definitely, 30% of the GDP and covering 30% of the population as well. Why don't we go to our friend in Singapore, Henry Gao from Singapore Management University, ask him about what Singaporeans and people in the region look at this pact. Henry, great to see you over there. Is it the sense among many Singaporeans that this RCEP new trade deal somehow is one that China dominates and overshadowing smaller countries where their benefits are not really there?
Well, I think that is the perspective held by some countries in ASEAN, but I don't think this is true. I think there is definitely a possibility of a lot of benefits for many smaller countries in ASEAN, because one unique feature of RCEP is this accumulation which basically says that if you are a member of RCEP and you use inputs sourced from other RCEP members, then all this will be counted as something originating from your country, and then you will be able to enjoy the benefits. So even smaller countries can enjoy the benefits under RCEP.
Yeah, Professor Gong, like from a scholar's perspective, this is huge, right? The reduction of tariffs.
Yeah, well, although it's going to be phased in over a couple of years, a very long time, but eventually the goal is to have zero tariff on practically all the stuffs, 90% of the traded goods, and that in itself basically creates a uniform market, right? It doesn't make much of a difference as to produce in this country or that country. Cross-border movements of goods and services will be basically not subject to tariffs, and also other non-tariff barriers. So I think this is going to be, economic growth is very much driven by market unification, okay, market integration. So I think with these steps in, I think it has a great future, especially I think among the countries currently engaged in the world's largest global value chain production networks, like South Korea, Japan, China, Thailand, Vietnam. These countries are already integrated into the global production value chain, and I think that this trend is going to continue.
Right, Marcus, I see you nodding your head over there. How exactly do you see this deal helping the exporters? You were talking about lobster farmers in Australia, wine exporters who are hurting from the current tensions between Beijing and Canberra.
Yeah, look, certainly Australia has an over-reliance on trade with China, and it's an unhealthy over-reliance, and it's faced risks. But we face a couple of crucial issues. One of them, we're still very much a commodities-based exporting country, and China pays top dollar for our exports, particularly our produce. Rock lobsters, which have made the headlines in the last week. China will pay $90 for a rock lobster. The best you're going to get anywhere else in the world is $55. So our fishermen have to sell into the markets that give them the best returns, because these fishermen are small businesses. Let's say a fishing boat might cost $750,000, and if you're 27 years old, you're married and you've got 2 kids, and you're paying off that boat, you have to go to that market. So it's not quite that easy. And the other thing, people in Australia, particularly the commentators, not necessarily the business community, make this ridiculous assumption that, well, China is just one market. It's not. China is 20% of the world's population. Not only that, it's a fast-growing market. It's a market where there's a great deal of complementary trade we can do. I think what Australia needs to do is seek to do business with other countries, definitely, but let's not just drop China and all of a sudden think we can pick up new trade elsewhere. So I think it just comes back to dialogue. We need better dialogue from the Australian side and from the Chinese side. I think China understands the problems we have in Australia. They understand where this anti-China sentiment's coming from and who's driving it. And a very good understanding. I think where China's lacking is knowing what to do about it and how to engage it. And that's a challenge for the diplomats and for the governments.
And Henry, how do you see this trade pact exactly benefiting countries like Singapore, where you live?
Well, Singapore, I think, definitely is going to benefit from this, because Singapore has free trade agreements with all of the big 4 players in the world: China, US, Japan, and EU. So Singapore is becoming really a hub in terms of free trade agreements. And this has attracted a lot of investment in Singapore. That is why, despite the pandemic, you see firms wanting to relocate to Singapore. And I think the effects of the free trade agreements is a big factor. So definitely Singapore would benefit. And because Singapore is a hub of Southeast Asia, so if Singapore benefits, I think a lot of countries in the region would benefit as well.
Right. But not everyone is looking at this deal this way. Let's, for example, show you one piece of comments from our viewers. Shashank Joshi, This friend said this, I'm going to read it out for you. RCEP does not herald a dramatic liberalization of Asian trade. Its origins are as a kind of tidying up exercise, joining together in one overarching compact the various free trade agreements between ASEAN and several other countries. Professor Gong, your thoughts?
Well, it's partially correct, actually. But as I mentioned, example, clearly Japan benefits a lot from this, right? It doesn't have a trade agreement with South Korea and China now. It does have one. But I think overall theme is probably right, that this is an overriding agreement encompassing many countries. It makes it into a multilateral big, for a big, very big block of countries. But I think what's more important is go beyond just looking at these sort of, trade-related issues. It's a step in the right direction of, liberalizing a whole bunch of things relating to the domestic markets, opening up. For example, competition policy. I mean, you don't see any competition policy at all in WTO. Now, they have a chapter in it talking about competition policy. Every country needs to establish an antitrust apparatus in a member country and has to be implementing these policies. So I think it's these issues certainly are being addressed. I mean, we're not going to address every issue that's going to be addressed in a CPTPP and then say, okay, this RCEP doesn't live up to that standard. I mean, in the world currently, there are not many trade agreements up to that standard yet, right? So, and of course, we have a very large diversity of level of economic development within this bloc. I mean, look at Cambodia, for example. Its per capita GDP is 1/10 of Singapore, for example, 1/10 of Australia. So, different countries have different perspectives. Myanmar is another good example. So, I think you can't set the same standard, same level of standard applying to every country, right? Because we have a quite diversity of countries in this bloc.
Yeah, this is a very interesting analysis there. The United States, of course, is another key player in the region. Washington says it has been a Pacific power, and it will always be. So, Marcus, I want to get your thoughts on the role of the Biden administration if he assumes office on January the 20th, which looks very likely right now. Democrats were not known as a party of free traders, but the GOP used to be known as a party of free trade. But after 4 years of Trump, what would you expect Biden to do when it comes to trade, of course?
Well, I guess the thing we've learned from America from the last 4 years is what can you expect? I think Biden will certainly tone down the rhetoric from the Trump administration. I think from a strategic perspective, America will continue to paint China as a strategic threat. Now, whether policymakers in America believe that to be the case, and I certainly don't believe it to be the case, and many scholars and commentators in Australia don't think China is a strategic regional threat, that they'll continue to say it. Trump has used it well to play to a domestic audience. But Biden, I think, might look at something like a comprehensive trade agreement, as we've seen come out yesterday, and think of it as just a little reminder that China is not necessarily on its own. Asian economies realise the future lies in their region. I think the Asian people right across Southeast Asia, and I spent time and lived and worked in Singapore, as well as having spent time in Hong Kong and China. They're very pragmatic, and they can put their differences aside and forge ahead and do business. So I think if the Biden administration sees this pragmatic approach, it might stay tough on China and stand up for US interests, but let's hope those economic interests hold back the strategic push. I mean, it's not as though China has military bases in Hawaii and in Cuba and in Haiti, and that's exactly the kind of proximity that you've got American firepower in the Asian region. I mean, it's the South China Sea, it's the China Seas, and the overwhelming dominant military power is the United States.
Exactly. We understand that we have Professor M.T. Dalapat with us now. Professor Dalapat, India pulled out of the RCEP due to reasons such as disagreements over genetic medications. New Delhi says it has no interest in reconsidering. What are the considerations of India? What does India stand to lose by perhaps remaining outside this pact?
Well, I'd like to point out that India has had a negative balance of trade with several of the countries that have signed RCEP. With some of the countries, India has got a very large negative balance of trade. With China, for example, it's about $55 to $60 billion in just 1 year. And the reality is, India wanted to get much more interested in services, in software, in pharmaceuticals, in labor standards, in skilled technologists and labor, for example. And in all this, the ASEAN countries and the other members some of the other members of RCEP gave absolutely no ground. So essentially, this became an agreement that was not really good enough for India to sign.
Yeah, we've heard from our Indian friend, Professor Gong. What do you make of the fact that India is not part of this RCEP?
I think it's a big loss for them. I think the administration in India made that decision mostly driven by domestic politics. People remember when China joined WTO, we also enjoyed a very large trade deficit. I mean, a balance of trade during the 1990s was not very good, right? This is not the reason to get away from free trade, get away from multilateralism. Protection of domestic markets, the last thing you want to do when it comes to economic development. And I think time and time again, not just here in China, but in other Asian countries, we've proven that this is the right path to economic prosperity. It is on the right side of history. So I think by skipping this very large deal, having access to a market of 30% of the world's population, India experienced a big miss out. And I think looking back, future generations of Indians will be deploying about this decision.
Very quickly, what do you think a Biden administration will do either with RCEP or maybe to RCEP?
The Biden administration will probably consider coming back to the CPTPP negotiation, I think. But now it's not a matter of Washington agreeing to join or not. It also involves other members. Japan is very much steering this organization, and I think that probably Tokyo wants something back by inviting the United States coming back to CPTPP. So I think we'll wait and see.
Well, we'll see how things evolve over there. Thank you so much for being part of tonight's dialogue. Professor Zhang Gong, always good to see you, my friend, and also Marcus in Australia, Marcus Rubenstein, editor of APAC News. Thank you so much, Marcus. Come back again. And that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Wang Wen in Beijing. I'll see you again soon.